welcome everyone to today's Synergist product demo webinar, Reducing Legionnaires' Disease Risk by Testing with Legialert. I'm Ed Rakowski, Editor-in-Chief of the Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially IDEXX for sponsoring this webinar. Today's product demo is scheduled for 30 minutes, and we'd like to reserve some time for questions from the audience, so I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dan Broder. Dan is the lead scientist for IDEXX's Legiolert R&D team. Legiolert is a quantitative, culture-based method that simplifies the detection of Legionella pneumophila in water samples. Dan is currently co-authoring international field trial studies on the performance of Legiolert versus standard method technologies. He earned his PhD in microbiology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he studied the biochemistry and metabolism associated with proteolytic breakdown in gram-negative organisms. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Dan.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome today. Today I'm going to talk about reducing Legionnaire's disease risk by testing with Legialert. And I'll start by talking about Legionnaire's disease in general. As you may or may not know, Legionnaire's disease is on the rise. CDC has estimated that since the year 2000, it's gone up about 5.5-fold. And some of this is due to an increase in reporting, but some of it is not. It is truly on the rise, and you probably have seen incidences of Legionnaire's disease in the news. Now, one interesting thing about Legionnaire's disease is that it is different from a lot of other microbiological waterborne outbreak kind of diseases in that it is fatal in some fraction of the cases. About 1 out of every 10 patients die when they contract Legionnaire's disease. And even if they don't, survivors often face some kind of long-term disability as a result of the lingering effects of the damage that has occurred during the time when they actually had Legionnaire's disease. And Legionnaire's disease is something that makes the news. It makes headlines, and there's often court cases that are implicated because of the disease. In many cases, if someone gets sick at a hotel or resort, that's not a good thing for the people, of course. People get ill and they can die. It's also bad for the resort or the hotel or the building managers as well, because there's a reputational and potentially financial liability there that everybody has to answer to. And really, the facilities owners are responsible. They're the ones who have to make sure that the water is being managed properly and that it doesn't run afoul with contamination by microorganisms. And there's really some ways to do that. You just have to make sure you have a plan in place to make sure that your water doesn't get contaminated, and to make sure that it doesn't stay contaminated. When the CDC has an outbreak that they're investigating, or other entities are investigating outbreaks, what they find time and again is that most of them could have been prevented. And the prevention occurs when you have this kind of a plan in place. And the CDC has estimated that about 90% of the time, some sort of plan would have warded off any kind of an outbreak that happened if they had just managed the water properly. Now, when it comes to Legionnaire's disease, the primary organism that is the causative agent of Legionnaire's disease is Legionella pneumophila. And it depends how you break it out when you're looking at the epidemiological evaluation of it. But basically, when there's an outbreak, about 95% of the time it tends to be because of this one species of Legionella, Legionella pneumophila. With regard to cases, that's about 99% of the time. And then when people die, it's nearly always from Legionella pneumophila. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because there are other species of Legionella that are out there. There's upwards of 70 of them, last I heard. But by and large, if you look at the people who die from Legionnaire's disease and you actually take a sample from those people and you find out which Legionella organism has caused the fatality, time and again, year after year, it's routinely above 95% of those cases are all attributed to Legionella pneumophila. And most of these are actually one variant of Legionella pneumophila, which is a serotype called serotype 1. The other serotypes, of which there are about 15, can also cause Legionnaire's disease and can be fatal, but it seems like serotype 1 is the one that's responsible for most of the disease. But Legionella pneumophila itself is the primary causative agent. Now, knowing this and knowing that Legionella has to be managed in your water system, how do you go about this? Well, luckily, there are some tools out there. And in 2015, an agency called ASHRAE, which stands for the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, came out with a standard, which is the first of its type, and it's called Standard 188. And this is Legionellosis risk management for building water systems. And this is basically a way for you to set up a water safety plan. And it doesn't drill down into the nitty-gritty specifics of it, because every building is different and every water safety plan is different. There's water safety plan consultants that can help you with that kind of thing. But this is really a tool for you to understand what the scope of a water safety plan is and what the responsibility of people who execute this water safety plan is, and the basics of how to go about doing it. And one of the key features about running a water safety plan is understanding your system. When it comes to Legionella pneumophila and Legionnaires disease, you need to understand how Legionella makes people sick. Legionella pneumophila, it makes you sick by breathing contaminated aerosolized water. So knowing that, you can look at specific kinds of water and understand whether or not they're going to be a potential hazard. So these are just some examples. On the top left is a shower, which is an example of a potable water. That if you turn the shower on and there is Legionella somewhere in the piping system, it can get aerosolized in the shower head and come out, and you can potentially breathe it in. Similar kind of thing for a fountain on the bottom left or a mister on the bottom right. Probably the most famous example is the top right, which is a cooling tower. And a cooling tower is, you live on the tops of buildings, and they serve to cool off the heated building elements. And basically what they are is a big fluid reservoir with a fan on the top. And this is how it cools off the building. That cooled water cools off all the elements inside. But if there is Legionella pneumophila in that reservoir or anywhere within the cooling tower system, that fan turns on and it can blow the contaminated aerosolized water droplets out into the environment. And some of these fans can be very, very large and put out a lot of this material. So you can imagine that if there's a lot of Legionella pneumophila in the system, it's going to blow a lot of them out and potentially not only spread out a high number of these organisms, but also spread them a significant distance, which is probably why most big outbreaks are attributed to cooling towers. However, when you look at the statistics, cooling towers are not the reason why most people die from Legionnaire's disease. It tends to be potable water that's responsible for most fatalities. Now, when you understand this kind of system, and you understand all of the building elements that are going to go into your water safety plan, how do you go about setting up a plan? And I'm not going to go through the individual steps that are outlined in Standard 188, but they're basically setting up a water management team and having that team go through the building and understand the systems and understand where the highest probability locations for Legionella contamination can be, and establishing a control measure, which is typically some sort of chemical introduction into the system, like chlorine or something similar to that, and then figure out how to validate what you've decided is going to be the safe way to run your system, how to validate whether or not that is working. And absolutely the way to validate that it's working is to test the samples. So you decide which samples you want to take in your building, and you test them to understand whether or not there's been contamination or whether or not your system is under control. And then you document all the activities. Testing is invaluable for this process. It's the only way to really know whether what you're doing is working. Some people have asked, if I have a really good water safety plan and I'm treating with the chemicals and I'm being very diligent about recording the treatment and things like that, do I still have to test? And the answer is yes, you do, because there's really no way for you to know whether it's being executed properly. The only way to know is to check. And the AIHA has explicitly stated this, is that monitoring your samples is critical to validate the effectiveness of your control measures. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about the testing, which is really my area. How do people do testing? Historically, it's been done on petri plates. What you're looking at here is a petri plate recipe called BCYE, and this is the favored media choice for cultivating Legionella species. And petri plate and agar plate, spread plate methods have been around for 100 years. And the reason they're still around is because they do work, they are reliable. What you're looking at here is colony growth. And a colony, if you don't know, if you're not a microbiologist, is basically when a cell lands on a plate, it starts to double and double and double, and once it gets to about 1 billion cells, you see this little colony growing. And a colony is about 1 billion cells. The nice thing about these plates is that when you're looking at them, every single bacterium is going to have some kind of different appearance or morphology or size. And a good microbiologist can take advantage of that to understand whether they think it's Legionella or not. And this is a pretty easy plate to count that you're looking at right here. The problem with Legionella is that it doesn't always look like this. Sometimes it looks like this. And the reason is because some of the Legionella samples that people take from buildings can be very, very messy, and it's a very long incubation time, which gives these other organisms a long time to take hold and take over the system. This makes it very difficult to read these plates. Because of the difficulty of this, people run all sorts of different tests in parallel to try and get a plate that's going to look more like the one on the left and less like the one on the right. And different countries and different agencies have come out with different protocols. And what you're looking at here are snapshots of flowcharts for each of these protocols. I'm not going to go through this in any detail. It's just an idea for you to look at to understand how complex some of the methods can be. The most common one is on the top left. This is the International Standards Organization method, but these other methods are all run to some degree. They all have something in common, which is you start with a water sample at the top, and I'll just highlight it with the mouse, and it can go into a couple different possible fates. But regardless of which fate it goes to, whether if it's a high count sample, you might plate it directly on the plate, or if not, you might filter it to concentrate it. In any case, you'll run this sample and subdivide it into multiple possible things. You might treat it with acid. Legionella has some resistance to acid, and that can enable you to knock down the background, or resistance to heat, which will do the same thing. You might use that in conjunction with antibiotics in the BCYE plate to further knock down the background. And the choice of cocktails of antibiotics is also variable. So all of these different variables get mixed and matched by the practitioners of these methods to suit themselves. And so everybody's doing a little bit of a different method, and so the different methods will give you different results. The ISO method, which is the most common method, has actually been updated in 2017 to give users this little grid at the end, which is sort of a combinational matrix of all of the different possible things you could run: concentration treatments, different media recipes, everything mix and match, and you can just choose whatever you want to do. The problem is you don't know what you want to do because you don't really know what the sample is going to be. You have some basic knowledge about the sample, like where it came from, but you don't know whether it's a particularly clean sample or not, so you really have no idea which of those subroutines you're going to run. Now, when you get to the end point here, the microbiologist looks at the plate and says, okay, I think some of these are Legionella based on my experience and what they look like, and I think some of them are not target organisms. There's something else. Regardless, if you're good at this, you'll look at this and say, I think this is Legionella, this is a presumptive, and you'll count all these up. And if you think there's more than one type of presumptive, you'll count them up independently. And the reason is because each one you suspect to be Legionella, you'll have to move forward with some sort of validation or confirmation step in which you take that material and you subculture it onto media where it should grow and media where it shouldn't grow at the same time. And if it passes that test, then it's confirmed. Then you can go back and do the math to figure out how many of those colonies pass the confirmation, and then you go back and do the math for your original sample and figure how many organisms were in the starting sample. So there's a lot of places for error, there's a lot of places for subjectivity here in the method, and this is one of the reasons why it's such a problem. What do you really need to know when you do a test, though? You really need to know how much Legionella pneumophila is there. Is that a meaningful difference from the last time you did the test? Has anything changed? And if something has changed, what is your action? Well, in order to answer those questions, what you have to have is data that is accurate, data that's reliable, and data that's available. And this is where people came to IDEXX many, many years ago and said, look, we have this Legionella problem. This test is a real bear to run. Can you help us out? And so IDEXX has done a lot of testing for water microorganisms and created a lot of great tests. And so we decided to embark on designing a test for this and came up with Legialert. Now, Legialert is also a culture test. It's just not a plate culture test. It's not a petri plate method. It's a liquid culture test. And the basic idea is pretty straightforward. This test reagent, you mix the powdered reagent with your water, and when you do, it'll give it the ability to detect Legionella pneumophila. It will detect all serogroups of Legionella pneumophila, not just serotype 1 or serotype 4, but all 15 of them. It works in conjunction with this device called a quantitative, which holds 100 mils of fluid. You can do this with potable or non-potable water, and that's really the only decision you need to know. You just need to know what the water you got is. If it's a cooling tower, you run a non-potable protocol that's fixed. If it's a sample from a sink, you run a potable protocol, and that's a fixed protocol. So that's the only real thing you need to decide, and it's not a decision. You know as soon as you know what the sample is. And the way this works is you mix up your sample a little bit. You mix up your sample with the powder. You pour it into this device, which is kind of like a bag that's sealed on 3 sides. And you've created a starter culture when you mix the powder with your water. And that starter culture then, when you put it into this device, you send it through a heat sealer. And what that will do is compartmentalize that fluid equivalently into all the different wells. And there's some big wells and there's some small wells, but the basic idea is that each well becomes its own distinct mini culture. It's separate from the others, physically separate, so it's not impacted by the others. And if at least one Legionella pneumophila has landed in one of these cells, it'll grow up into a high-density culture and turn it this color, and you just count out the ones that have turned color and the ones that haven't. So it's really easy. So it's really, really easy, but does it work? We've done a lot of studies to try and validate and understand the performance of Legialert versus other petri plate methods. We've done independent laboratory studies globally. And when we did these studies, these were with real samples. We didn't take organisms that we had stored in the freezer and put them into water. These were samples that actually were part of the regular operations for these laboratories. They just split them in half and ran them on the same day with their normal method and with Legialert. And then we tried to understand what the performance difference was. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of the bigger studies. The first study was one we did versus a standard from the standard methods compilation of microbiological methods, 9260J. It's pretty similar in workflow to the other ones that I saw. And what you're looking at here is something called a Youden plot. And the basic idea is pretty simple. It's a statistical way to compare data for samples. So whenever you run a sample, you get 2 data points, one from one method and one from the other method for the same sample. And you basically just make an XY coordinate out of that. And each XY coordinate here is a single sample. And so in a perfect world, if both methods got exactly the same number for every sample, they'd fall right on this center line. But this is microbiology, and there's a little bit of variation. So you see some below the line and some above the line. But basically, with these samples, it's pretty similar performance across the board. And these are for the low concentration points. If you step out to the samples that had a little bit higher concentration, what you find is a little bit of a different picture. You see that Legialert actually found some of these pneumophila where the standard method had very low or no count. And in some cases, these were above a given action limit for a system. And this is really what the problem is that the standard method has all these complexities, so if there's a breakdown in one or more of the steps, you might get a failure to detect. Legialert is so simple that really doesn't happen very often, and so you see these situations where you got good detection, but you didn't see it in the standard. A similar thing was found in a different study. This was a much bigger study. This was one we did in Germany with potable water with 6 laboratories. And a similar picture emerged. In 445 of the positive samples, we got detection with both methods. In 56 of the samples, we got detection only by Legialert. Now, some of those were kind of low count, so we didn't really count them as really being a detriment to the standard. But in 17 of those, they were very high counts, ones that were above an action limit. So that represents kind of a danger in using the standard because you're missing the detection of Legionella pneumophila in these samples. The reverse only happened 26 times for detection and 5 times for those being above the action limit. So it's more sensitive when there's a problem, 3 times more sensitive to miss it. Those were all potable samples. With non-potable samples, we found another interesting picture, which is that when the samples are very, very dirty, as some cooling towers tend to be, you have a lot of trouble seeing the colonies on those plate media. And I showed you a picture of some of the messier plates. And that can be done. That can be observed sometimes when you run these cooling tower samples. Legialert tends to handle those a little bit better when they're very, very hot or overgrown samples with a lot of bioload. It tends to be able to handle them better. And we quantified this by showing that when the count on the plates went up, the sensitivity of Legialert became greater and greater over time. So comparing all the positive samples, Legialert was a little bit more sensitive, but not statistically so. But as the counts go up, you see this blue bar grows a lot faster than the orange bar, basically meaning that Legialert is able to handle messier samples. So these are 3 studies that were done that IDEXX oversaw and the independent laboratories ran. There was another study that was done, and we actually didn't even know it was being done until we saw this poster at a conference. This was run by the EPA. And I'll give you the summary here. I know you can't read any of the text here. But basically, the EPA found something similar to these other studies that were done, in that they found it to be very, very simple to perform, a lot less labor intensive. It performed as well or better than the standard agar-based methods in qualitative and quantitative detection of pneumophila in premise plumbing water samples. So they found exactly the same results as these other studies that I've been reporting. So to go back to the protocol a little bit, Legialert is very simple. All you really do is you take a water sample, and your water sample can be 100 mils if it's potable water. If it's non-potable water, it can be less than that. And you take this blister pack powder reagent, you pour it in the sample, and you shake it up. That's a starter culture. You take your starter culture and you pour it in this quantity tray. It's kind of like a bag. It's sealed on 3 sides. You just pour it in. You send it through the heat sealer. It takes about 10 seconds to go through the sealer, and then it's done. You put it in the incubator for 7 days. And that actually sounds like a long time, but the standard method is even longer than that, and I'll show you some pictograph of that in just a second. But once it comes out, here's what it looks like. I showed you a picture of this before, but this is my colleague having run some Legialert here. You can see it's pretty simple to read, pretty simple to run. The read is pretty straightforward. It's not always perfectly brown, but it's a very easy read. Most of the time it's a very robust brown. It can be a little bit lighter in color, but any of these are judged as positive, so it's pretty straightforward. If it's anything different than the negative control, then it's a positive. Compare that to plates on the right, where this is probably a best case scenario on the top, and as you go down it gets more difficult. This is pretty common with plate methods. So Legialert is very reliable. It provides reliable trending data. This reliability has been seen across labs, within labs, and over time, and we've done a lot of studies to prove this out and highlight these features. Now, Legialert is available in a lot of different laboratories that offer it, and if you go to IDEXX.com, you can look at this map and click on these little red dots, and it'll take you to a laboratory that's near you that's capable of running Legialert. If you have a laboratory that does microbiology for you now and they don't run Legialert, you can certainly contact them and talk to them a little about Legialert and see if that's something they would be interested in doing. The key thing you need to understand when you select the laboratory to run your Legionella test is that they be accredited. What is accreditation? It is a system that laboratories go through in order to make sure that they have a robust testing protocol. They usually have a quality management system, they have audits, they've passed proficiency tests, they have quality assurance for all their equipment, and they have documented technical competence. This is critical if you're selecting a laboratory to make sure they have these kinds of features and properties in order to make sure that the samples you send to them to run for testing are going to give you reliable results in order to support your water safety plan. The other nice thing about Legialert, as I mentioned before, is that it doesn't require a whole lot of sample. Some of these other methods that I showed the flowcharts for earlier will typically recommend collection of about 1 liter of sample, which is not real easy if you're collecting a lot of samples in a building. Some buildings you might collect 15 or 20 samples, and if you're collecting 1 liter each, then that's pretty difficult. Plus, then you have to ship them or transport them, which is also difficult. For Legialert, for potable water samples, you only need 100 mils. For non-potable samples, you only need 1 mil. So the shipping and transport is greatly facilitated with this protocol. And as I alluded to before, Legialert is a little bit faster than the standard methods. It delivers confirmed quantitative results. And when I say that, what I mean is you don't have to do a confirmation from Legialert. It is very selective, which means that you're not going to get a lot of false positives from it. You don't really have to weed through the positive results. Once it turns positive, you know it's correct because we've done all the validations in these peer-reviewed studies to show how selective it is. So it's faster just from incubation. It's also faster from the fact that you don't have to confirm it. Legialert is a fixed 7-day read. If you're careful and you don't let the trays get too cold, you can quickly peek at them early and they'll start coming up in about 5 days, but the real quantification is not ready till about 7 days. For petri plate methods, they start to come up in the 5-7 day range, but even if you have a positive, you have to go through that confirmation step, which also takes an additional 2 to 3 days of growth depending upon the isolate itself. And these plates really aren't thought to be complete until 10 days. You really got to wait for the full 10 days for you to understand whether it's truly a negative sample. So the method takes 10 days, and then if there is something that comes up positive between 7 and 10, you have to do the confirmation to make sure that it's correct. So how does a water safety plan work with this testing as part of it? The plans are really only as good as the data you get. And this is sort of a fictional water safety plan data set that I created. This is just the Legionella pneumophila data. A lot of water safety plans will have other data too. But this is just a fictional plan where you're testing every 4 weeks. And if you look at it, you're going along, you're testing, you're not really seeing anything. Maybe around week 28, you see a little something coming up here. And then in week 32, you test it and you see a much higher result. This would be a point where your water safety team has already come up with a plan of what you would do. Most people would retest it to make sure it's not an anomaly, and here, this is what they've done. This is only 7 days after this result. You see there's a positive result. Okay, now it's time to do something. Probably you would heat the system or add some sort of chemical or whatever it is your water safety team has agreed upon, and then you would test it again to make sure that what you did had the desired outcome. This is exactly what a water safety plan is designed to look like and designed to do. Legialert is ideal for this kind of plan. It's accurate. It finds the dangerous species, Legionella pneumophila, that petri plates can miss. It works in really tough samples. It's very reliable because it's very, very easy to read. It's objective. It's very repeatable and reproducible because of its simplicity. You can get it from accredited laboratories. It's a 7-day result, and it doesn't require very much sample. So why would you choose this? Gives you the better data, you can make better decisions, and really what you achieve is better protection. That's the whole goal here, is for protection. And so that's what Legialert allows you to do. So you can go to IDEXX.com and look up Legionella testing, get more information about this. And that's my last slide. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Dan. We have just a few minutes for questions. Just a reminder to our audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send to all panelists. We have one here for you, Dan. Where do I find someone who can help with our water management plan?
Yeah, there's a lot of water safety plan consultants out there. The best way to do it is to reach out to us directly at IDEXX.com. There's also a list of accredited laboratory, or the best way is to reach out to us directly, and we can point you in the direction of some good water safety plan people.
Great, thanks. Fatma asks, does this product work only on living cells, or does it work with remaining dead cells as well?
It only works on living cells because this is a live growth culture. If the cells begin dead, then they won't be able to grow in Legialert.
Okay. Another question, should we really be testing if it's not required?
The answer is that you're liable if you don't. If somebody gets sick in your facility and you haven't really been doing a complete water safety plan, which involves testing, then you're liable for that. So yes, you should be testing. You know, and people have asked me before, if I have a really great plan and I'm doing all the right things, do I still need to test? And the answer is, of course you do, because you don't know whether the right things are having the desired outcome.
Okay, David asks, do you need to neutralize the disinfectant in the collected water sample before testing?
Yes, if it's a potable water sample, you do, and the reason is because actually, if there's ever something like chlorine in the system, you want to neutralize it with sodium thiosulfate or something similar so that it doesn't carry a residual toxicity during transport. But yeah, but that's usually done at the point of collection. Yeah.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more. My management doesn't want me to test because they are afraid we'll find something. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, that's sort of an ostrich kind of mentality. I think really if you don't want to look for something, then you won't find it, but you will find out if someone gets sick later on, and that's really not terribly defensible later on from a legal standpoint. You know, if you do have a discussion with your manager about it, then that itself has already become kind of a situation where your manager now is aware of the situation. So you pretty much have to test after that point.
Dan, I'm sorry, I do want to get this one in. Are the kits provided by the laboratory, or do we purchase the kits and then send to the lab?
The laboratory would purchase the kits.
Okay. And just one more from David. Any concerns with the testing media for tests of municipal water supplies using monochloramine for disinfectant?
No concerns. I mean, if there's any kind of way that you would want to neutralize that, that's the same that just like anything else, you would neutralize it at the point of collection. Okay,
great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. My thanks to Dan Broder for his presentation, to IDEXX for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. Please note the registration is now open for 2 more Synergist webinars, including one tomorrow, April 17th at noon. You can register for upcoming webinars at AIHA.webvent.tv.
Great, and this concludes today's webcast. Thank you very much for attending. The recording will be available at AIHA.webvent.tv, and we will send all registrants an email tomorrow with this link. While you're there, please visit our event calendar to sign up for future events.